Karak Eight Peaks did not sleep. It only waited for something new to die in its depths. That night, it found something worse. Skrika Half Moon crouched in the dark, with blood drying on his hands and a fresh tunnel, breathing cold air against his face. And for the first time in his miserable backstabbing life, he realized he'd found a way to kill everyone at once. All he had to do was survive long enough to use it. Behind him, his tribe sharpened knives in the gloom, already deciding which one would go into his back first. Chapter 1. The Hidden Way. The dark beneath Karak. 8 Peaks had a weight to it. It was not the clean dark of night under open sky, where the moon could still find you and make a promise of silver on blade edges and wet stone. This was old dark, buried dark, the kind that had been steeping for centuries in collapsed mines, murder hollows, dead hearths, and rat-dug burrows. It pressed low over the tunnels like a ceiling of damp velvet and rot. It clung to the lungs. It made torch smoke sluggish and thick. It made every scrape and chitter sound too close. Boss Skrika Half Moon liked it that way. He stood on a ledge of cracked black rock no broader than a coffin lid, one clawed hand braced on the wall, the other curled around the shaft of his moon-crook spear. His yellow eyes glimmered under the rim of his iron-capped hood. Below him, a file of night goblins picked their way through a collapsed lower gallery in single line, hunched under fungus lanterns and bent beneath bundles of rope, scrap planks, rusty picks and sacks of stolen powder. They moved like a centipede made of rags and knives. Above and around them, the mountain groaned. Karak Eight Peaks was never still. Somewhere far off, stone cracked like old bones under pressure. Water dripped from unseen heights with a slow, maddening patience. There came faint hammering from some dwarf hole deeper in the rock, or perhaps it was only the mountain remembering hammering. Sometimes, if the tunnels held their breath long enough, there was the scratch, scratch, scratch of skaven claws from behind walls, too thin to trust. Skrika turned his head and spat into the abyss. The goblins below flinched at the noise, then glanced upward at him and pretended they had not. Good. Fear was a leash. Better than loyalty. Cheaper, too. At the front of the line, 2 goblins with hooked poles worked at a fall of shattered stone and timbers that blocked the tunnel mouth. The collapse looked ancient. Old beams blackened by mildew, chunks of dressed masonry with faded dwarf runes on them, a crust of stalagmite growth fusing it all together into a knotted slab. One wrong strike, and half the overhang might come down. One careful strike, and nothing would happen for a week. Skrika bared his teeth. "Hit it harder!" he hissed. The 2 goblins exchanged a look. One of them, a long-nosed runt with one blind eye, licked cracked lips and jabbed more tentatively at the blockage. Skrika raised his spear. "Harder," he said, very softly. That got through. The runt hacked with both hands. Chips flew. A buried timber snapped with a noise like a jaw breaking. Dust coughed out of the seam and rolled across the file in a grey curtain. Several goblins started squealing that the roof was coming down. One bolted. Skrika moved before the squeal had finished. He dropped from the ledge, hit the lower path in a crouch, and sprang in the same motion. The fleeing goblin managed 3 slapping strides before Skrika's spearhead punched in through the back of his neck and burst out the front in a wet spray. The goblin went rigid, feet drumming once, then collapsed, twitching around the shaft. Skrika planted one foot between the shoulders and yanked the weapon free. Blood splashed hot across his knuckles and steamed in the lantern light. "No running," he snarled at the file. "Tunnels not cursed." Just full of nervous laughter rippled through them, the kind given by creatures who had just been reminded they were prey if they misstepped. From somewhere near the rear came a soft, needling voice. "Could still be cursed." Snagler Wormtongue sidled into view, hunched beneath his fungus staff. Little charms of knuckle bones, bat wings and dried cave lizards hung from his robe and clicked faintly as he moved. His face was hidden under layers of grime and painted moon signs, but his eyes shone with feverish delight. He was chewing something green that stained his gums. Skrika hated those eyes. "Everything's cursed to you," Skrika said. Snagler shrugged. "Everything is. Some places just know." He lifted the staff toward the blockage. The cap of the great cave fungus lashed to its end gave off a corpse-blue glow. In that light, the dwarfen stones in the collapse looked slick as old teeth. Between two slabs, behind the packed rubble, there was a black seam where no seam should have been. Skrika had noticed it before any of them, a breath of cold air on his face, when all the other cracks breathed mildew and dust. A hollow note when the pole hook struck. Space beyond. Hidden space. A lost way. That was why he had dragged half a tribe down into these forgotten lower guts, instead of raiding the upper ruins like any sensible boss, with an instinct for survival. Rumors had come from mushroom pickers and squig herders and one half-skinned loon who had crawled out of a sinkhole shrieking about old stairs beneath the roots of the mountain. Most bosses would have laughed and cut his throat for the noise. Skrika listened. There was always wealth where things had been buried long enough, wealth or a way to murder those who already had it. He crouched by the crack and held his lantern close. The air leaking through was colder now, moving steadily. Not a pocket, a passage. Behind him came the soft scrape of boots. Gritch Backstab slid from the shadows with his usual cat-quiet malice. He was lean even for a night goblin, all elbows and knife angles beneath lacquered black mail, with a scar crossing his upper lip, so his mouth always looked half-curled in contempt. He wore 2 blades on one side, a hooked dagger on the other, and had a habit of standing just far enough behind a body to make it wonder if steel was already on the way. "Could be a dead end," Gritch said. "Could be a vault," Skrika replied. "Could be skaven on the other." Skrika grinned without humor. "Then it's a way to—" Gritch's eyes narrowed. That was the real thing then. He had seen it too. A path that was not on anyone's telling of the deeps. A vein of stone through the corpse of 8 Peaks that might open into dwarf galleries, old granaries, abandoned armories, skaven burrows, blind wells, any number of profitable horrors. Whoever controlled such a route could sting from the dark and vanish before either enemy found the knife, and whoever owned that power would not stay merely a boss. The thought hung between them, rank as the tunnel stink. Skrika stood and pointed at the blockage. Groans shivered through the mob. Powder meant noise, and noise meant attention. Dwarfs listened. Rats listened better. Still, 2 goblins shuffled forward with a leather sack of blasting charge stolen from some dwarf cache 3 raids ago. Their hands shook so badly they spilled half of it before packing the rest into a cavity between the broken stones. One of them stuffed in a filthy fuse, and then both backed away too slowly, staring at Skrika the entire time, as if begging him to change his mind. He didn't. He took the fuse, lit it from a torch, and only then stepped back. The hiss sounded deafening. The entire line compressed against the walls or crouched behind shields as the spark wormed down into the crack. Snagler started muttering to the bad moon under his breath. Gritch smiled a thin, private smile, as though hoping the blast would save him the trouble of later murder. The explosion punched the tunnel flat. Fire belched out in a red-orange slab. Stone fragments screamed through the dark. One goblin at the front took a fist-sized chunk of masonry in the face and simply ceased to have a face. He was thrown backward in a fan of blood, teeth, and wet splinters. The shockwave knocked Skrika sideways into the wall. Dust boiled up so thick it smothered the lanterns and left the whole passage roaring blind with coughs and shrieks. Then the mountain settled. When the air cleared enough to see, the blockage had slumped inward. Broken beams leaned over a jagged opening big enough for 2 goblins abreast. Beyond it lay darkness vast and clean and wrong. Skrika pushed through the dust, stepping over the headless corpse and the spasming body that used to belong to it. He lifted a lantern and entered first. The tunnel beyond was not a tunnel at all, but a worked stoneway, broad and low-arched, the craftsmanship unmistakably dwarfen even under centuries of ruin. The flagstones were cracked and upheaved by roots of mineral growth. Pillars carved with worn geometric patterns marched away into the murk. Half-collapsed side passages yawned to either side. Old iron brackets still clung to the walls, some holding the fossilized remains of torches. Here and there lay rusted rings, snapped chain lengths, a broken cartwheel, fragments of ceramic jars ground into the dust, and everywhere signs of later trespass, scratch marks, claw grooves, gnawed bones in corners, midden heaps of shredded fungus cloth and black pellets. In one place, a tunnel had been crudely dug through a masonry wall and then abandoned. In another, a section of floor had been lifted from below and cracked like a shell. Not dead then, forgotten by neither side, merely neglected. Skrika's heart beat harder. He saw it whole in a flash, as greed often showed truth more clearly than wisdom ever could. Dwarfs above, nursing their holdfasts in bitter little pockets. Skaven below and beyond, boiling through their worm runs and poison nests. And here between them, a lower road no one fully held. A knife hilt sticking out of the guts of the mountain, waiting for the hand mean enough to grip it. "Mine," he whispered. Snargler came up beside him and took a long sniff, nostrils fluttering. Old smoke, rat musk, dead grudges. "Ooh, this place has Mogga Squig-mother shouldered in next, broad and filthy, her leather apron crusted with old gore. Something had bitten off 2 fingers on her left hand years ago. She used the stump to point into the shadows. "See?" she grunted. At the edge of the lantern glow, in a drift of dust beside a side passage, lay a crescent of tiny white bones. Goblin bones, dozens of them, gnawed and cracked open for marrow. Mogga's grin widened. "Squig's been down." "Good," Skrika thought. Squigs meant caves. Caves meant hidden ways. Hidden ways meant advantage. Also teeth. Mostly teeth. He turned slowly, studying every face nearest him. Snagler with his moon-mad stare. Mogga with her scarred jaw and butcher's shoulders. Gritch, unreadable as an unsheathed knife. Around them the lesser goblins shifted and sniffed and muttered. They understood enough to know they were standing on something valuable. Greed shone in the dark like fever. That made the next part inevitable. The first knife came from behind. Skrika heard only the scrape of a boot and the intake of breath. He twisted as the blade flashed past his ribs and opened his side through cloak and mail rings. Not deep, deep enough to sting and wet him. The attacker, one of Gritch's grinning underrunners with filed teeth and a red rag tied round his wrist, hissed in surprise that the strike had not taken kidney. Skrika slammed his forehead into the goblin's face. Bone craquait, teeth flew. Before the attacker could stagger, Skrika caught his knife arm, bent it backward until the elbow snapped, and rammed his spear butt under the chin. The goblin choked on a spray of pink froth and collapsed, clawing at his own throat. That was the spark. Half the corridor erupted in snarls. A second goblin lunged at Skrika from the left with a hatchet. Mogga intercepted him with one meaty swing of her chain flail, caving in his temple so hard his eye bulged out wet and jelly bright before the body dropped. Somebody screeched that Gritch had made his move. Somebody else screamed that dwarfs were attacking. A spear went wild and punched through a lantern fungus, showering the floor with blue fire spores. Skrika ducked the hatchet blow's backswing, seized the haft, and yanked its owner into kneeing range. He drove his knee up between the goblin's legs, felt the soft collapse there, then tore the hatchet free and buried it in the side of the creature's skull. The blade stuck. He let go. All discipline vanished. Goblins shoved and hacked in the packed stoneway, slitting each other open by lantern light, while others flattened themselves against pillars, unwilling to choose a side until they saw which direction fortune ran. One slipped in blood and went down under 3 stamping feet. Another got his mouth opened from ear to ear by a hooked blade. A third was thrust screaming through the crude rat-dug breach in the wall and vanished into the dark beyond with the fading rattle of falling stone. Skrika spun, looking for Gritch. There, not in the melee, of course, a little back from it, balanced near a pillar, knives low, watching, measuring. Gritch's lips curled in that same half-smile. This had not been meant to kill Skrika cleanly, only to start confusion. Let underlings make the first cut. Let the boss bleed. Let the tunnel decide. Coward's work. Skrika ripped the hatchet from the corpse beside him and hurled it. Gritch moved fast, but not fast enough to keep the blade from clipping his shoulder. Iron rang on mail, bit, then spun away. Gritch hissed and vanished backward into shadow with 2 of his loyal knives around him, melting down a side passage before Mogga could charge. The brawl guttered almost as quickly as it had begun. That was the way of goblin violence. Explosive, ugly, brief. Once it became clear, the boss still stood, and Gritch had fled. Instead of taking the head, courage ran out in everyone else. The last resistors were clubbed down, disarmed, or simply dragged before Skrika while they wailed that they had thought someone else was in charge now. The stoneway stank of fresh blood. Skrika stood in the middle of it, breathing hard, his side burning where the knife had sliced him. Around his boots lay 6 corpses, and a 7th, who was still trying to hold his intestines in with both hands, while whimpering for mercy. The guts kept sliding through his fingers in hot loops. Skrika crouched before him. "Who told?" he asked. The goblin gargled, eyes huge and wet. Skrika gripped a fistful of intestine and pulled. The scream echoed down the ancient dwarf hall, bounced from pillar to pillar, and ended in a bubbling moan as the goblin folded over himself. The others looked away. Even Mogga stopped grinning for a heartbeat. Skrika rose, slick to the wrist. "Listen good," he said, voice carrying through the hush. "This road is ours, mine. Dwarfs didn't find it. Rats didn't find it. Gritch didn't find it. He pointed the bloody spear down the darkness of the lower way. "We hold it. We got anyone on it. We learn where it goes. We strike where they ain't watching. Up into beard holes, down into rat nests. We take both. We take every shiny bit, and every sack o' grub, and every blade worth." The goblins stared. Fear warred with greed inside them, and greed began to win. Skrika bared his teeth wider. "Tell the tribe dwarfs attacked us here. Tell 'em dwarfs killed our lads. Tell 'em there's a road beneath the road where treasure's piled thicker than squig eggs. Tell 'em anyone who wants a share comes to Snagler let out a breathless, delighted cackle." Mogga wiped gore from her flail and nodded once, heavy and eager. In the ranks beyond, whispers began, spreading fast as mold. Dwarfs, treasure, a hidden road, revenge, perfect. Far down the stoneway, somewhere beyond the reach of their lights, something moved. Not the shuffle of goblin feet, something lighter, quicker. A faint, skittering scrape. Then silence. Skrika heard it and smiled into the dark. At last, he thought. Something worth killing. Chapter 2. Squigs in the Dark. By the time the tribe came boiling down into the hidden stoneway, the blood on the flagstones had gone black. Night goblins crowded the ancient dwarf passage in a muttering press of hoods, blades, fungus lanterns, and bad breath. They came in snarling knots around petty bosses and banner rags, shoving for position, craning to see the new road Boss Skrika Half Moon had claimed with lies, murder, and just enough truth to make both convincing. Word had spread upward through the warrens, exactly as he had wanted. The dwarfs had struck first. The dwarfs had found a lower path. The dwarfs had left treasure below. The dwarfs had killed goblins on that road, and if there was one thing a night goblin loved almost as much as stolen silver, it was a grievance he could sharpen into an excuse. The air was sour with damp stone, old soot, and the reek of the gathered tribe. Squigs snarled in iron muzzles. Cave bats circled above the lantern glow, vanishing into the high dark between broken arches. On the walls, worn dwarf carvings watched the mob with blank, contemptuous faces chipped, almost smooth by time. Skrika stood on a chunk of fallen masonry near the mouth of the hidden way and let them look at him. His side was bound in fungus cloth where the knife had cut him, though blood still seeped through in dark patches. He had not hidden the wound. Wounds were useful. They told a better story than speeches. The goblins saw the ripped mail, the cracked blood on his gloves, the dead underbosses dragged aside into a heap near the wall, and they understood the road had been paid for already. That made them hungry. It also made them careful. Beside him, Mogga Squigmother hauled on a chain leash thicker than a wrist. At the other end of it, a great cave squig lunged and gnashed, a swollen ball of slab muscle and red hide with needle teeth crammed into a face too wide for nature. Its lidless eyes rolled in every direction at once. Strings of yellow spit swung from its mouth and hissed on the stones. Behind it, smaller squigs bounced and snapped in cages, or strained against handlers armed with prod poles and iron hooks. Snugla Wormtongue crouched on the broken masonry at Skrika's feet, drawing looping moon signs in old blood with the end of his staff. He sniffed every few moments like a beast testing the wind, then grinned to himself as if hearing private jokes from the dark. The tribe waited. Skrika raised his spear. "This way ain't one," he barked. "It's found. That means there's still things living in." A few goblins laughed too quickly. "Things with teeth," Mogga growled, jerking the chain as her great squig surged forward. "Big." The laughter died. Skrika pointed his spear into the black throat of the deeper road. "Scouts say the stoneway breaks ahead into caves. Old caves. Natural ones. Big enough for squig nests, maybe worse. Past that, more worked halls. Rat scratch on some walls, dwarf marks on others. We clear it all. We hold it. Any grot that turns tail gets a spear in the back. Any boss what thinks to get clever gets fed to the first beast we catch still. That last part was for Gritch backstab, though Gritch himself was nowhere to be seen, or rather, not seen clearly. Skrika spotted him soon enough, partway back in the crowd, with his shoulder bound beneath black mail. One side of his mouth curled in that same narrow smirk. He had brought his loyal knives and merged them into the mob again, neither defiant nor submissive, simply present, waiting. That was Gritch's gift. He never stood where blame could reach him cleanly. Skrika held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, as though unconcerned. Let him think the wound had slowed him. Let him think there would be a better opening further in. "Move!" Skrika snarled. The column lurched into motion. The first stretch of the lower way kept the old dwarf shape for perhaps half a mile. Broad flagstones, half-fallen pillars, blind side galleries sealed by ancient cave-ins or broken through by later digging. The tribe advanced by lantern light and fungus glow, boots slapping old stone, spear hafts tapping against shields. Every sound came back, changed. Here, a laugh echoed like a cough from another throat. There, a dropped blade clanged, and the mountain sent the note away into distances too large for comfort. Every few dozen yards they found signs that the passage had not truly slept. A rusted dwarf helm, flattened under something heavy, a midden of gnawed bones, rat droppings, old goblin graffiti scratched over older dwarf runes, both half obscured by mineral seep. Once, they found a dead skaven nailed to a wall, with iron spikes through wrists and jaw, so old its hide had dried to parchment over the bones. Its teeth were still bared. A few goblins spat at it for luck. One tried to pry loose a bronze ring from its tail, and lost 2 fingers when the brittle thing snapped and sent him sprawling into a patch of sink moss that ate his skin in greasy white strips before anyone dragged him out, screaming. The deeper they went, the worse the stonework got. The floor cracked and pitched downward in long, uneven slopes. Pillars leaned drunkenly where the ceiling had shifted. Whole sections of the hall had slumped into natural caverns below, forcing the tribe over narrow ledges and makeshift ramps of old debris. The air changed too. The dwarf dust and stale smoke gave way to a hotter, fouler stink of beast droppings, damp fungus, and that sour copper tang of old blood, soaked into cave dirt over many feedings. Mogga lifted one scarred hand. The column halted in a twitching, muttering bunch. Ahead, beyond the edge of the lantern glow, came a wet, rhythmic sound. Tearing, crunching, a low, slobbering snort, then another, then several, from different directions, overlapping in a hungry chorus. Mogga's grin widened until the scars on her cheeks went white. There! Skrika edged forward until he could see into the first of the caverns. The dwarf hall opened suddenly into a chamber of broken stone and slick mineral humps, its ceiling lost in black. Stunted phosphor fungi clung to the walls in pale blue clusters. Bones carpeted the floor, not neat heaps, but a churned midden of everything that had ever wandered too close. Goat-like cave beasts, bats, rats the size of hounds, old goblin skeletons, and here and there fragments of mail or split shields. Between the bones lay shapes like boulders, until they moved. Cave squigs, a dozen at least in the first chamber alone, maybe more half-hidden behind stone folds and fungus groves. Some were man-sized, others twice that, their hides mottled crimson, bruise purple, and corpse pale, where old scars puckered the flesh. They fed with total concentration, jaws ratcheting through carcasses in sickening jerks, teeth grinding bone into wet white splinters. One had half a dead skaven hanging from its mouth and was shaking it hard enough to spray gobbets of meat across the floor. Another sat atop a mound of fungus and bones like a toad on a throne, its belly round as a cauldron. The tribe shrank back despite itself. Then one of the smaller squigs looked up. Its eyes rolled, fixed on the lanterns, and something like thoughtless delight passed over its face. It screamed. The sound was a hideous rubbery squeal, high and raw, and every other beast in the chamber snapped toward it in the same instant. Mouths opened, legs bunched beneath swollen bodies. Skrika roared. The first leap hit like a boulder loosed downhill. A cave squig, the size of a brewery vat, crashed into the front rank, flattening two goblins under its bulk, with a noise like sacks of turnips dropped from a height. Teeth closed on a third and bit him in half at the waist. His legs kicked twice, while his upper body vanished into the beast's mouth, amid a gush of dark ropey entrails. The rank behind broke immediately, some thrusting spears, others just shrieking as more squigs bounded in. A handler lost grip of a chain. The great, leashed squig, beside Mogga, went mad at the scent of blood and hurled itself into the melee, dragging three goblins off their feet behind it. One slammed face first onto stone and skidded, leaving teeth behind. The chained beast hit a wild cave squig side on. Flesh burst. Both monsters rolled, biting chunks out of one another in a frenzy of wet, snapping jaws. A goblin trapped beneath them screamed until a heel-sized tooth punched up through his chest. Skrika lunged into the front himself, spear stabbing. He rammed the mooncrook point into a squig's lipless mouth and felt the shaft jar as iron scraped palate and punched into the soft roof above. The beast convulsed, blood spraying down the wood in hot sheets. It thrashed so hard he had to wrench free or lose the spear entirely. Another bounded at him from the right. He ducked under its leap, smelled its gut-rot stink, and chopped with his side blade as it passed. The knife slit its belly from throat to base. Loops of steaming intestine burst out and slapped across his shoulder. The squig landed, bounced once, and came apart from its own momentum, spilling viscera over the stones like a toppled butcher's basket. The cave erupted into full slaughter. Night goblins jabbed from behind shields, while the bravest or the stupidest darted in with hooked blades to hamstring squigs between leaps. Those caught in the open died uglier. One beast landed atop a pair of archers and flattened them into a red paste that squelched between flagstones. Another clamped onto a goblin's head and shook until the spine came out with it. Blue fungus light flashed on slick hides and flying gore. The air became a stew of screams, beast squeals, iron clang, and the nauseating sound of meat being worried apart. Mogga waded straight into it, as if into a pleasant rain. She swung her flail two-handed, the spiked head smashing squig eyes, caving cheek flesh, cracking teeth the size of daggers. When one leapt for her, she let it hit, seized the iron ring through its muzzle with her stump and good hand, and drove a pig-sticker up through the underside of its jaw again and again until black blood fountained over her apron. She laughed the whole time, thick and ugly. Skrika saw opportunity inside the chaos. A knot of goblins on the left flank had stopped fighting and started backing away in a panic. Not common tribe rabble, Gritch's lads. Easy to spot once you knew the little tells. Matched ragknots on their wrists, blackened blade hilts, the sideways glances toward the shadows where their master should have been. They retreated not from fear alone, but with purpose, drifting toward a narrow stone neck where the cavern floor pinched between a column stump and a rock fall. Ambush ground. Skrika's lip curled. So that was Gritch's game. Let the squigs break the front. Let the boss commit. Then collapse a bottleneck, or cut him off in the confusion. He bellowed for the tribe to press the center and shoved toward the left with a dozen of his own harder killers. Another squig bounded across his path. He sidestepped and hacked the hamstring of its back leg. The tendon came free in a greasy string. The beast landed, spun, and the goblins behind him swarmed it with spears, driving iron through eye, mouth, and the soft flesh under the forelimbs until it went still beneath them, twitching. The stone neck ahead shook. One of Gritch's goblins, crouched behind the pinch point, slammed a pick into a cracked support jutting from the ceiling. Another hacked at an old beam, wedged under a hanging slab. Stone dust sifted down. Skrika saw Gritch then, up on a ledge behind them, one hand pressed to his wounded shoulder, the other raised in a little mocking salute. The slab dropped. The collapse came with a roar that swallowed the cavern. Tons of fractured stone and rotted supports crashed down across the neck, obliterating the passage in a choking surge of rubble. 3 of Skrika's goblins vanished under it so completely they might as well have been erased. One caught only the edge and was pinned from the waist down, his lower body crushed to pulp, while his upper half clawed at the stones and screamed for a mother that had probably eaten him if times had been harder. On the far side of the fresh fall, Gritch and his followers melted back into a side crevice, cut off from the main chamber exactly as intended, only not with Skrika trapped there. He had stopped short the instant he saw the crack lines above. Now he stood in the dust storm and grinned with savage delight. Gritch had botched it by inches. Better, he had sealed off half his own supporters, with the beasts in the deeper dark, because the collapse had not blocked the squigs. If anything, it had enraged more of them. The thunder of falling stone woke the cave beyond, and from tunnels behind the rockfall came answering squeals, deep booms of bodies hitting stone, the scrabble of many claws. Shapes hammered at hidden gaps, forcing bloody snouts and rows of teeth through openings too small for them. Gritch's trapped goblins began shouting in sudden real terror. One shrieked from the far side, "Boss, get us out!" Skrika laughed in his face. Then the first giant squig came through. It burst from a high side cleft above Gritch's position like something vomited by the mountain itself. A monstrous pale brute with scarred hide, blind milk-white eyes, and a mouth that seemed to split half its body. It landed in the middle of Gritch's knot, hard enough to knock goblins flat. Before they could rise, it bit one clean across the shoulders, teeth punching out through chest and belly in a rain of ribs and gobbets. Another follower turned to run, and the brute's back leg snapped out, driving him head first into the wall with such force his skull opened like a dropped crock. Gritch vanished in the chaos, either buried under his own men or fleeing through some rat crack only he had marked. Skrika did not waste time looking. He had his proof. He had his revenge. He had a cave full of beasts, still trying to eat him. He roared. Drive him to The chamber floor sloped subtly toward a dark sink at its far end, where old dwarf stone had broken away into a lower pit. Until then the tribe had been too busy dying to use the ground. Now, under Skrika's curses and Mogga's delighted howls, they turned the melee into butchery with method. Goblin spears herded wounded squigs sideways. Nets, weighted with scrap iron, went over leaping beasts, tangling their limbs just long enough for prod poles and hooked chains to drag them toward the lip. One huge mottled squig hit the edge, scrabbled with claws, then toppled backward into the dark, with 3 goblins still hanging from it. The impact below came a long moment later, followed by frantic squealing and a wet crack. Another beast burst through a screen of fungus and straight into Mogga's handlers. She took the bite on a skaven's shield, let the jaws crush wood and arm together, then rammed a rusted mining spike into the creature's eye so deep the point punched out the back of its skull. By the time the last savage bouncing shapes withdrew into the tunnels or lay twitching in heaps, the cavern floor looked like a slaughter yard after a flood. Blood ran in red-black sheets through the grooves between stones and pooled in old dwarf tool marks. Severed limbs, burst guts, broken spears and teeth the size of fingers lay strewn among the bone carpet. Dead goblins and dead squigs had become hard to tell apart at a glance, both reduced to torn meat and split hide in the blue fungal gloom. The survivors panted and stared around with the expression of creatures astonished to still possess their own insides. Skrika stood amid it all, drenched to the knees. His spear was gone, snapped somewhere in the first rush. He held a hacked-down axe in one hand and a skin torch in the other. Smoke curled around his hood. His side throbbed. Blood, some his, most not, dripped from his elbows. Around him the tribe had gone quiet in that brittle, awed way goblins sometimes did, when violence had exceeded even their expectations. Mogga limped over, cradling her chewed arm, and spat out a mouthful of black squig blood. "Good cave," she said. Skrika turned toward the deeper passage the beasts had defended. Beyond the chamber, half hidden behind a curtain of hanging fungus and a tumble of shattered stone, the old dwarf way continued. He could see it now in broken glimpses. Worked blocks under cave calcite, the edge of a carved arch, a stair descending into a level lower still. On one wall, barely visible under slime and claw marks, was a line of old dwarf runes cut deep into the stone. On another, newer scratches crossed them at frantic angles, skaven marks, no mistaking the filthy, hurried style of them. Proof the route truly ran both ways. Around him the goblins began to understand it too. Greed lit their eyes. Fear remained, but now fear had a shape they had beaten and a promise waiting beyond it. That was enough to keep them moving. Skrika lifted the axe and pointed into the dark. "Clear the bodies, take the teeth. Anything still wriggling, finish it. Then we go." No one argued. They had won the first gate of the hidden road, and the price for it lay in steaming heaps under their boots. But deeper in the dark, past the gore-slick cave, and the butchered squigs, and the sealed-off fate of Gritch's followers, the lower route opened on, black and patient and full of new ways to die. Skrika smiled at it with blood on his gums and murder in his heart, and led the tribe down. Chapter 3. Poison Wind. The first ones did not die screaming. They died puzzled. A pair of goblin sentries crouched beneath a cracked dwarf archway 3 levels below the squig caverns, passing a skin of mushroom liquor between them and arguing in sour whispers over who got to keep a skaven knife taken off a corpse 2 nights before. The hidden route had widened there into an old processional hall, carved from dark basalt, its ceiling ribbed with soot-black beams, and its walls lined with broken dwarf ancestor statues whose faces had been chiseled away by time, vandalism, or both. Blue cave fungi burned in cages along the walls. Their weak glow pooled over piles of rubble, snapped chain, old bone and damp patches on the floor where mineral water bled from the stone. It was the sort of place where every noise echoed wrong, and every shadow seemed to lean closer when you looked away. One sentry took another pull from the skin, lowered it, and frowned. "What's that?" The other sniffed. "Nothing. No." It came soft at first. A crawling thread of greenish haze, licking low along the floor from the dark of the westward passage. Not smoke, not mist. Something slicker than that, as if the air itself were rotting and had chosen to crawl. It pooled around their bare ankles. The goblins wrinkled their noses. One opened his mouth to call farther down the hall. Then he coughed. Not a proper cough. Just a small, surprised hitch in the chest, like swallowing the wrong way. He coughed again, harder. The lantern light caught wetness at the corners of his mouth. The second goblin started laughing at him until the haze reached his own knees and his laugh broke into a wheeze. The first sentry's eyes bulged. He dropped the wineskin and clawed at his throat. A string of pink foam ran from his lips. His coughs became violent convulsions that folded him in half. Something came up with the third one. A gobbet of dark blood and yellow-flecked phlegm. He stared at it on the floor as though it belonged to someone else. Then, more blood spilled from his nose in a steady sheet. By the time he tried to run, his legs had forgotten how. He made 2 lurching steps, struck the statue plinth beside him, and slid down it, fingernails scraping furrows in the stone while his lungs worked themselves raw inside his chest. The second sentry stumbled after him, already blind with tears, both hands over his face. He was still trying to shout when he vomited a clot of black blood across his own knees and pitched forward, twitching. The green haze rolled over them and kept going. Farther in, another guard post heard the coughing and came to investigate. 3 goblins rounded the bend with shields half raised and saw the bodies writhing in the smoke. One shouted for a shaman. Another turned at once to flee. Thin shapes flickered through the gas behind them. The first skaven came in low and fast, masks strapped over their twitching snouts, glass globes hanging from harnesses at hip and chest. Their eyes shone red through the gloom. Curved blades flashed green in the fungus light. One gutter runner hit the rear goblin at a sprint, bounded off a wall, and slit his throat in mid-leap so cleanly the head hung on skin for a heartbeat before the blood came pumping out. Another skaven drove a hooked knife up under a shield rim and into the goblin behind it, ripping open the belly in one savage pull. Intestines spilled out slick and pale, coiling onto the stones as the victim toppled backward with both hands inside himself. The last goblin got his spear down and managed a wild thrust that scraped sparks from a skaven breastplate. A gas globe smashed at his feet. The globe burst in a greasy flash. Green vapor boiled up around his waist. He shrieked and stumbled, his skin blistering even as he breathed it. His scream turned wet. He dropped the spear and pawed at his own face, tearing strips from it with his nails as if peeling off a mask. When he fell, the skaven were already past him, flowing deeper into the root like venom through a wound. By the time the alarm reached Skrika, the lower way was a charnel maze of blind panic and poison. He was in an old dwarf granary chamber that had become his rough command den, standing over a cracked stone table, while Snagler smeared bat blood over a scavenged map slate and muttered that the moon was "sittin' funny." In the Maga squatted by the doorway, feeding gobbets of offal to a muzzled squig the size of a barrel. Gritch was absent, which was never comforting. Outside the chamber, the hidden root pulsed with the ugly life it had gained over the last few days. Runners passing orders, goblins hauling squig meat, looters dragging back broken dwarf iron, and sacks of molded grain, sentries bickering, fungus lamps flaring and dimming in the damp. Then the first survivor came blundering in. He hit the threshold at full speed, tripped over the stone lip, and crashed face first into the room. He was bareheaded, slime-coated, eyes swollen red and leaking. He clawed at the floor and left bloody fingernail crescents in the dirt. "Gas," he rasped. "Boss West turn rats." Then his back arched. Blood frothed from his mouth in thick, dark bubbles. His chest seized and did not properly start again. For one frozen beat the room held still. Then the corridor outside erupted with screams. Skrika was moving before thought caught up. He kicked the dying goblin aside, snatched his spear from beside the table, and shouldered past Mogga into the hall. What hit him first was the smell. Not merely rot, though there was that. Not merely smoke. It was sharper, almost sweet in places, with a bite that caught behind the eyes and seemed to hook into the meat of the sinuses. A stink that promised sickness before it delivered it. Green vapor boiled around the bend ahead, thick enough to turn the lantern glow swampy. Shapes stumbled out of it. One goblin came reeling down the corridor with both hands over his mouth, blood pouring between his fingers. Another ran blind until he struck the wall hard enough to crack teeth, then turned and began hacking wildly at the stone with his knife as though trying to cut through the mountain. Behind them, in the smoke, lean forms skittered and darted. Skrika bellowed, "Rags, cover ya!" Not all of them heard. Not all who heard obeyed fast enough. A skaven gutter runner shot from the haze at waist height and buried twin blades in the throat of a goblin scrambling to tie cloth over his face. Blood sprayed the wall in a fan. A second ratman sprang atop a pile of rubble and hurled a clay canister into the packed mob outside the granary. It shattered underfoot. The vapor that burst out was yellow-green, denser than the first, and hot enough to make skin shine wet where it touched. Goblins screamed and shoved over each other trying to get back. One fell. Boots pounded his ribs flat and snapped his jaw sideways while he was still breathing. Mogga roared like a cave beast and let her squig off the chain. The thing launched into the corridor like a cannonball of meat. It hit a masked skaven square in the chest, flattened him against the opposite wall, and bit down. Armor crumpled. Rib bones cracked loud as sticks. When the squig jerked back, the upper half of the skaven came with it, while the lower half slid down the stones, leaving a rain black sheen. Skrika rammed his spear through another attacker's belly and pinned the rat to a pillar. The skaven writhed there hissing, claws scrabbling at the shaft. Up close its mask was a horror of stitched leather and green-stained brass, with glass eyelets and little filter canisters hanging under the snout. Skrika drove his knife under the mask and up into the jaw until the point came out through one eye. The body bucked, then sagged. "Fall back to the," he shouted. "Not this way." The granary corridor was too narrow to hold if the gas thickened. He knew that much instantly. They would choke in it, or die penned up while the skaven cut at them through the smoke. Better to give ground into broader chambers where the air might move, and the goblins could use numbers. He hated retreat, but he hated dying stupidly more. The tribe sloshed backward through blood and green fog, dragging the wounded, leaving the worst of them where they lay thrashing. Skaven pursued in bursts, never staying visible long. One heartbeat they were only glints in the vapor. The next there would be a hooked blade sliding under a goblin arm, or a sling stone punching out an eye, or a gas globe bouncing and rolling to rest under panicked feet. At a four-way junction marked by a toppled dwarf ancestor statue, the rear ranks broke completely. The smoke hit them thick. Half a dozen goblins threw down shields and bolted in different directions. One ran straight into a side passage and vanished with a shrill cry followed by gnawing sounds from the dark. Another dropped to his knees and began clawing at his own tongue as if it had betrayed him. A third collided with Skrika himself, begging and weeping through a rag slick with bloody spit. Skrika punched him in the mouth, hard enough to scatter teeth. "Stand or die," he snarled. The goblin tried to stand. That was enough. Snuggler appeared through the murk, like some cave spirit dragged up from a bad dream. His robe was soaked dark where somebody else's blood had splashed it. He had wrapped fungus cloth around his face and crammed fistfuls of crushed glowcap and bitter cave moss into the folds. In one hand he carried his staff. In the other, a clay bowl coughing blue-gray smoke that smelled like mold, saltpetre, and old socks. "Breathe this, not that," the shaman cackled. "This smoke knows our." He shoved the bowl under the nose of a goblin convulsing against the wall. The goblin inhaled, gagged, nearly vomited, but his spasms eased enough that he could stumble onward. Snagler began thrusting pouches of the bitter fungus mix into whoever would take them, screaming that the green rat breath hated cave moss and moonspore. It was lunatic nonsense, which meant it might have been true. Either way, the ones who stuffed the stuff into their rags coughed less and saw farther through the poison. Skrika seized on it at once. Every lad takes shaman rot over his mouth. It was not a cure. It was survival, measured in narrower margins. But it gave him enough time to get the core of his warband into the split hall, a wider chamber where the old dwarf way intersected a collapsed ore lift and a natural vent shaft climbed somewhere into the black. Air moved there in sluggish drafts. The gas thinned, though it still hung in ghostly tendrils around ankle and waist. Bodies were everywhere. Some were theirs. Goblins sprawled on the steps, bubbling blood. One bent backward over a broken handcart with his belly opened and the stone beneath him slick with loops of gut. Another slumped upright in a niche, dead eyes fixed on nothing, while his fingers still clenched. A snapped spear shaft. Some were skaven, too. Mogga's squig had reduced 2 to meat ribbons near the entrance, and one masked gas team rat lay on the hall's center dais with half its face missing where an axe had sheared through mask and skull together. Skrika crouched over that corpse. The harness at its side carried 3 more glass globes, a satchel of clay canisters, and a bundle of waxed papers tucked into a leather tube. He ripped the papers free and unrolled them against the corpse's chest. Maps, crude, fast, but useful skaven scratch lines marking tunnels, vents, choke points, and approach paths to the hidden route. Not complete. Enough. Greed cut through the battle haze. "Alive," he muttered. "Need one." He rose and barked for a strike band, his meanest stabbers, 3 net men, 2 of Mogga's handlers, Snagler with his bowl of reeking anti-poison smoke. Then he took them straight back into the green dark. The skaven were confident now. That was their weakness. They thought the gas had softened everything for them. Thought the goblins were in full rout. Twice they tried to encircle the strike band inside galleries, and twice Snagler's stinking smoke let Skrika's lads see them just soon enough to counter-ambush. In the first fight, a gutter runner dropped from a ceiling beam and landed on a goblin's shoulders, sawing at the throat with a serrated blade. The goblin went down, shrieking, blood pumping over both of them. Skrika lunged in, hooked the rat behind the knee with his spear, and tore it off balance. Mogga's handler netted it before it could recover. They beat it half-conscious and kicked away its knives. In the second, a trio of gas team skaven rolled globes around a bend and rushed behind them with pikes. One globe shattered against the wall. The vapor billowed. A goblin took a full breath and collapsed at once, coughing shreds of pink lung onto the floor. But the charge through the smoke brought the skaven into reach. Skrika parried one pike with his spear shaft, stepped inside and drove his blade through the ratman's throat until the point grated on spine. Another skaven took an axe to the snout, the mask caving inward with a crack, green glass and bone punching into its face. The last tried to flee. Mogga's freed squig caught it from behind and tore the spine out in one jerking bite. The live one they dragged back by the tail. It woke trust to a broken dwarf throne. In the split hall, mask ripped off, one leg bent sideways at the knee. Its fur was patchy with sores. Its yellow teeth clicked ceaselessly between pleas and threats. Around it stood a ring of goblins, some coughing blood into rags, all staring with that ugly mixture of fear and delight creatures wear when someone else is about to suffer on their behalf. Skrika set the captured maps before the skaven and squatted eye level with it. "Tell me where your lot's coming." The skaven spat in his face. Skrika sighed and nodded to Mogga. She stepped up behind the throne, seized the broken leg with both hands, then bent until the joint came apart fully. The scream that followed was high enough to make even goblins wince. The ratman thrashed and fouled itself, froth and snot stringing from its jaws. Skrika waited for the screaming to fray into whimpers. "Again," he said. This time he got answers. Those skaven answers were always bent through cowardice and self-preservation. Rickett Sootnose, a tunnel captain or something near enough, had found signs of trespass in the lower burrows and decided to scour the route with gas rather than waste bodies. Teams were pushing from 3 directions, using vent shafts and worm tunnels the goblins had not yet charted. More would come if the hidden road looked worth taking. Always more with skaven. When the skaven started trying to lie about numbers, Snagler took over. The shaman leaned close and whispered to it through rotten teeth, telling it what the bad moon did to liars underground. Then he dribbled a little of his blue fungus smoke into the skaven's eyes. The creature shrieked, convulsed, and babbled out routes, passwords, marker scratches, and the location of a supply burrow where fresh gas globes were stored. When it had no more to give, Skrika slit its belly and left it tied to the throne, while its insides slowly steamed onto the dais. The goblins watched until the twitching stopped. By the next cycle of lantern refilling, Skrika's answer was ready. He chose a knot of expendable runners, and one especially sniveling underling who owed Gritch too much loyalty to be trusted. Into the underling's hands he placed a leather tube containing altered maps real enough to look convincing, false enough to guide any skaven strike force into an old dwarf hall. The goblins had only half cleared because of the traps there, falling blocks, spear slits, pressure plates, deadfalls. The dwarfs had built murder into the architecture and left it armed for centuries. All the better. Then Skrika arranged for the messenger to be. A skaven patrol found him exactly where they should have, half-conscious in a side passage, coughing blood, one leg gas-burned, whimpering that the boss was retreating east with the tribe and all their loot. He sold the lie beautifully, perhaps because he believed it might save him. The skaven slit his throat anyway after taking the tube. Skrika shadowed them through the back ways. When the gas team and their escort reached the trap hole, they entered wary, masks glinting, pikes probing. They had a few moments to suspect before the first pressure plate clicked. Then the ceiling came down in sections. Stone blocks the size of carts smashed the lead ranks into red paste. Spear batteries punched from hidden wall slits, hurling yard-long iron bolts through armor, flesh, and the rats behind them in the same shot. One gas globe burst under falling rubble, filling the central aisle with poison just as the survivors tried to scramble clear. Skrika's goblins hit from both side galleries then, slinging rocks and stolen skaven knives, whooping as trapped rats choked, burned and bled under the old dwarf mechanisms. It was ugly, efficient work. A ratman clawing at a spear through his abdomen got his hands nailed to the shaft by 3 goblin arrows. Another tore off his own gas mask to breathe clearer and died doing it, lungs boiling pink through the mouth. The goblins dragged back a rich haul from that slaughter. Globes, masks, pikes, satchels of black powder pellets, and more maps. That was when the dwarfs noticed. Poison smoke had a way of traveling. So did noise. The trap hall's collapses boomed through lower galleries, older and straighter than the goblins knew. Vent shafts coughed green haze upward into sealed dwarf works that had remained untouched for generations. Somewhere ahead, in stone rooms still defended by stubborn hands, bearded holdouts smelled skaven gas and heard battle in the walls. The first dwarf answer came as silence. The whole approach corridor the goblins had used for 2 days was found blocked by fresh-cut stone and iron wedges driven into the cracks. No old collapse this. New work. Disciplined work. Behind it they could hear, very faintly, hammering. Another scout path ended in a murder slot suddenly opened in a wall. 3 goblins approached the corner, and a heavy crossbow bolt the length of an arm punched through the first one's sternum and into the second. Both bodies thrashed on the shaft for several breaths, while the third ran screaming. After that came the runic lamps glimpsed far off in the dark, moving in hard, steady lines where goblin lanterns bobbed and flickered. Dwarfs were awake below, and behind, the skaven were not beaten. Not truly. They had been bloodied, angered, embarrassed perhaps. That only made them worse. New marker scratches appeared overnight in side passages. Sentries vanished, leaving only little black paw prints in their blood. The gas attacks became more careful, more probing, pushing from behind and from above through cracks that no goblin would have believed a body could fit through. By the end of the cycle, the hidden route belonged to no one. Skrika stood on a broken stair, overlooking the split hall, and felt the whole thing tightening around him like a fist. Ahead, in the deeper galleries, the dwarfs sealed corridors and set their kill zones. Behind, Skaven crawled through smoke and rubble, sharpening fresh knives for his back. In the chambers between, his own tribe muttered and watched and counted corpses, while Gritch's name passed in whispers from knot to knot, like a disease that had not yet chosen where to burst. A goblin runner came limping up through the hall, face gray, rag over his mouth. "Boss," he said, voice shaking, "West sentry's gone. Just blood left. And somebody carved your sign upside down on the Gritch." Skrika looked out over the route he had wanted so badly, this buried artery of Karak Eight Peaks, soaked now in gas, blood, and old grudges, and bared his teeth. Dwarfs in front, rats behind, knives in the middle. At last, he thought, it was becoming worth owning. Chapter 4. The Glorious Betrayal. By the time Boss Skrika Halfmoon chose to betray everyone at once, the hidden road beneath Karak Eight Peaks had become a place even goblins crossed in a hush. Not from reverence, never that. From dread. The lower route no longer smelled like old stone and abandoned dwarf work. It smelled of things layered one upon the other until the nose lost track. Stale poison gas in the mortar cracks, singed fungus, skaven musk, goblin offal, scorched black powder, old blood under fresh blood, and the sour thick stench of too many corpses left too long in side passages, because nobody had enough spare hands to drag them out. The walls sweated slime where the poison had condensed. The flagstones were slick in places from fats and gore ground under countless feet. Broken spears and shattered shields lay in heaps against the pillars. Here and there dwarf bolts still jutted from stone blocks, their shafts blackened by age and newer use alike. In the dark above, cave bats fed on the flies. It was perfect. Only a fool wanted clean battle in such a place. Clean battle was for dwarfs with banners and drums, for men who still believed steel met steel because honor demanded it. Skrika preferred a fight where nobody could see properly, where the ground was treacherous, the air bad, every corner blind, and victory belonged to the creature most willing to stab while smiling. 8 Peaks had given him that. Now he meant to make the mountain choke on it. He stood in a ruined mustering hall at the heart of the hidden route, looking down over the stone basin that would become the kill box. Once it had been some grand dwarfen assembly chamber, broad and tiered, with stairways descending to a central floor of fitted black granite. Ancestor faces ringed the upper walls, in high carved niches, all bearded and stern, and most defaced noses broken, eyes gouged, oaths scratched over with goblin obscenities and skaven claw script. 3 main passages entered the basin. The north approach, still held in part by Doran Blackpick's dwarf holdouts, the south lower galleries, from which Rikit Sutnos's skaven filtered in gnashing clusters, and a westward slope where Skrika's tribe crouched among rubble, fungus cages, and stolen traps. Above the basin, the roof sagged badly. Great cracks ran through the vault. Oh, several pillars had shifted on their bases and leaned with an almost thoughtful slant, as if considering when to fall. Old dwarf chains hung from the ceiling where braziers once swung, now only black loops in the dark. Snargler had spent the morning muttering around those chains and tapping at the fault lines with the butt of his fungus staff, giggling every time dust sifted down. "She's ready," the shaman had whispered. "Mountain's got a loose tooth. Just needs a—" Now Snagler crouched beside Skrika again, his face streaked blue and white with moon paint, his grin too wide for comfort. He had piled stolen skaven globes, dwarf blasting kegs, fungus powder bundles and oil jars into little nests among the cracked pillars below. Some were hidden under corpse heaps, some behind fallen statuary. One sat inside the hollow chest of a toppled ancestor figure, as if the stone dwarf had swallowed doom and was keeping it warm. Mogga Squig Mother waited lower on the west slope, with what remained of her beasts. They were meaner now than at the start, and hungrier. A dozen cave squigs strained against chains and muzzle frames, their sides shivering, their jaws champing at the scent of blood already on the air. Behind them, two great squigs loomed in the dark like swollen boils of muscle and scar tissue. Iron spikes hammered through their collars and hooks, sunk into the rock to keep them from launching themselves early. Goblin handlers stood nearby with prod poles, though none stood very close. One wrong twitch, and a handler became meat. Gritch Backstab stood at the opposite end of Skrika's line, where the narrow western stair descended into the basin, not openly defiant. Not yet. He had his knives around him, hard-eyed and silent, and his own little knot of tribe rabble who had drifted under his influence these last days. He had taken to wearing a strip of dwarfen mail over the shoulder Skrika's hurled axe had clipped, and there was something almost ceremonial in the way he held himself now, as if he had already begun imagining the posture of a boss. He had not moved against Skrika again since the Squig Caverns, which only made him more dangerous. A goblin who failed once learned. A goblin who waited learned better. Skrika let him wait. He had larger treacheries in motion. The bait had gone out in both directions before the lanterns were even trimmed. To the dwarves he had sent proof real enough to sting, false enough to guide. Skaven marker stones, planted in a culvert beneath a sealed dwarf access hall. A dead ratman in gas gear, arranged where Doran Blackpick scouts would find it, and a panicked goblin prisoner, shoved within earshot of a dwarf picket to babble that the rats were massing for a full thrust north through the lower galleries. To the skaven he had sent another gift. Stolen dwarf rune lamps hung in an abandoned stairwell, a dragged trail of casks and ingots toward the basin, and the whisper that the beard things were shifting valuables out before collapsing the route behind them. Both sides had reasons already. Skrika merely sharpened them and pointed. It did not take long. From the north approach came the first hard rhythm of ordered boots on stone. Not many, by the sound of it, but enough. Dwarfs did not waste movement. They came like iron being lowered into water, steady, heavy, inevitable. Soon after came the glimmer of shield lamps beneath the arch, and the squat outline of warriors in mail and scale, axes at shoulder, broad shields locked. Doran Blackpick strode among the front rank under a darkened helm crested with broken black horsehair. He was not a grand lord, not some gilded relic of old songs, just a tunnel captain ground down by years of bad stone and worse enemies, which made him more dangerous than vanity ever would. His beard was bound in iron rings gone green with damp. One side of his face was a map of old scars. In the lamp glow his eyes looked like chips knocked from flint. From the south lower galleries came the skaven. They did not arrive with dwarfen certainty. They spilled. First scouts hugging shadows, then gutter runners on the walls and chains above, then masked gas teams with their globes and pikes, then the denser knot of clan rats behind them, pushing and snapping. Rickett Sootnose came near the middle, under a cloak of slick black hide. Brass mask worked into a sneering muzzle, one claw resting on the stock of a hooked warplock pistol. He was smaller than Skrika had imagined, thin even for a skaven, but he moved with the confidence of something that believed in poisoned outcomes more than honest odds. His tail lashed with quick, irritated flicks. His eyes never stopped moving. Skrika watched both forces edge into the basin from opposite sides and felt a grin worm across his face. No drums, no speeches, no challenge. They saw each other and understood enough immediately. The dwarfs locked tighter. Shields came up, axes lowered. The first rank planted itself in a short, brutal line just past the north arch, refusing the temptation to rush into open ground. Behind them, crossbows and handguns took positions in the stair mouths and ruined niches. Dorin barked an order. It was one word, hard as hammer strike, and the line halted with machine obedience. The Skaven did what Skaven always did when denied confusion enough to hide in. They overcompensated. Rickett shrilled a command. Gas teams spread left and right. Slingers scampered up the tiers. A pair of rats rolled a globe toward the dwarf line to test them. A dwarf crossbow snapped. The lead Skaven's throat opened and he folded without a sound. The globe rolled on. Dorin pointed. A hammerer stepped forward and hit it with the flat of his axe, batting it back down the steps like a grotesque game ball. It burst among the front Skaven ranks in a bloom of dirty green. 3 rats went down clawing at masks and faces before the rest recoiled, snarling. Then the first shots truly began. Bolts hissed from the dwarf line and punched through fur and leather. Sling stones cracked against shields and visors. A handgun boomed like thunder in the enclosed chamber, and a Skaven gas-bearer lost half his chest in a red mist. The basin filled with shrieks, barked orders, ricochets, smoke. Still, Skrika held. His goblins crouched in the west rubble and watched 2 hated enemies begin tearing strips off one another. Some twitched with impatience. Some were visibly wondering whether the boss had gone soft in the head. Mogga licked blood from cracked lips and kept one hand on her squig chains. Snagla giggled and patted his bomb nests like pets. Critch drifted a step closer through the dim, as though drawn to Skrika by respect. His knives spread subtly behind him. There it was. Skrika did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the basin and spoke loudly enough for the nearest few to hear. Wait till they're good, Anne. That was when Gritch moved, not with a speech, not with a roar, with speed. A hooked knife flashed from behind and opened one of Skrika's bodyguards from spine to navel in a single ripping cut. The goblin dropped screaming, trying to hold himself together while his guts sagged through his fingers. Gritch lunged through the falling body at Skrika's side, all lean force and quiet hate. Skrika had expected the angle. He twisted. The blade meant for his kidney scraped across mail and bit only into flesh. Pain flared white-hot under the old wound, but he was already turning with it, shoulder first, smashing into Gritch's chest hard enough to stagger them both. They crashed together onto loose rubble. Gritch slashed upward with his offhand and cut Skrika across the cheek, opening it to the teeth. Blood ran into Skrika's mouth, hot and salty. Around them the west slope erupted. Gritch's loyalists pounced on Skrika's guardband in a snapping whirl of knives. Goblins grappled among the stones, biting, gouging, sawing at exposed throats. One of Mogga's handlers took a blade under the ear and dropped kicking. Another was shoved backward into a chained squig, which bit his face off before the body hit the ground. Mogga bellowed and swung her flail, caving in the ribs of the nearest traitor, so deeply the iron spikes burst from his back in bloody buds. Below, in the basin, dwarfs and skaven finally committed. Ricket, perhaps believing the west side commotion meant weakness, shrieked for the charge. Clanrats flooded forward in a screeching wave, gas teams lobbing globes overhead. The dwarfs met them halfway up the north stair, with a shield wall impact, like a mine cave-in. Axes rose and fell. The first skaven rank broke against iron and discipline. Bodies piled instantly. A dwarf lost his hand at the wrist to a serrated skaven blade and fought on with the stump pumping red over his shield rim until a spear took him through the eye. 2 clanrats leapt onto a shield and were hacked apart so violently their pieces bounced down the steps. Gas burst among the melee, turning the air swamp green. Dwarfs coughed and pressed on through it, faces hidden behind cloth and iron. Skaven shrieked and stabbed at gaps. It became a grinder. On the west slope, Skrika and Gritch rolled apart and came up low. Gritch's grin was all blood now. Should have died in the cave. Should have buried you deeper, Skrika spat. Gritch came in fast, twin knives weaving. He was better on his feet than Skrika, better at close murder, every strike neat and economical. One knife punched through Skrika's sleeve and sliced the meat of his forearm. Another skimmed his ribs. Skrika gave ground over broken stone, parrying with the haft of his spear, feeling strength leak warm under his rags. Gritch pressed, certain at last that the boss was wearing down. He did not see Mogga's dead handler slumped behind him. He did not see the chain looped around the corpse's wrist. Skrika kicked the body. The chain snapped taut around Gritch's ankle just as he lunged. His footing went out from under him. He crashed sideways into the rock face. Skrika hit him before he could recover, driving the spear point clean through one shoulder and pinning him there. Gritch screamed, more from rage than pain, and clawed for a knife. Skrika punched him in the mouth. Teeth sprayed. Punched him again, then ripped the spear free and buried it lower, under the ribs. Gritch sagged, but did not die. Mean creatures rarely did quickly. Boss. He coughed, trying to grin through the blood. Skrika grabbed him by the throat and dragged him, struggling, to the lip overlooking the basin. Below them the battle had swollen into full madness. Dwarfs held the north stair, but were being drawn farther out by skaven pressure from the flanks. Gas clouds drifted in greasy sheets through axe strokes and spear thrusts. Dead and dying carpeted the center. Ricketts' teams were pushing left toward a side rise, where a clear shot into the dwarf rear waited. Doran himself had moved into the front ranks, hammering with a broad-headed axe that split rats' skulls as if cracking nuts. Every blow left something ruined. Perfect. Skrika hauled Gritch upright by the neck and shouted to the tribe, "Traitors!" Then he flung Gritch down the slope. The lieutenant bounced off broken steps, rolled through blood and rubble, and landed in the basin among battling dwarfs and skaven alike. He was still trying to rise when a gas globe burst near him. Green smoke swallowed him. Shapes converged. Whether a rat pike, a dwarf axe, or the gas itself finished him, Skrika never knew. He did not care. The sight of their almost boss disappearing into the maelstrom did more for discipline than any speech could have. Gritch's remaining followers faltered. Skrika pointed with his spear. Mogga's handlers ripped the pins on the squig chains. The beasts went down like living cannon shot. The first great squig hit the skaven left flank, plowing through 2 gas-bearers and a clan rat standard in a spray of green vapor, splintered bones and shrieking fur. The second bounded straight into the knot where dwarfs and rats were deadlocked, landed on a dwarf shield line, and crushed 3 warriors flat before biting a 4th from shoulder to hip. Smaller squigs followed, bouncing from corpse heaps and stair rails, tearing indiscriminately. Panic spread in ripples. Skaven turned on one another to escape the beasts. Dwarfs hacked at everything within reach, grimly magnificent and doomed to be surrounded by chaos. Skrika sent the goblins in behind them. They came not as a proud charge, but as a flood of knives through cracks. Over side rubble, down broken steps, out of culverts and side galleries, Skrika had kept hidden. They hit wounded rats, isolated dwarfs, downed shield-bearers, gas teams busy reloading. Goblin spears jabbed into eye slits, hooked blades hamstrung from behind. One dwarf was dragged off his feet by 6 goblins hauling on his beard rings, then opened at the groin and left to drown in himself, while still trying to crush skulls with his fists. Rikitsutno saw the trap too late. From the middle tier he shrieked new orders, trying to pull his gas teams back from the center and swing around the west rise. A pistol shot cracked, taking a goblin through the throat. Another skaven globe arced toward Mogga and shattered against a pillar near her, washing her in green fire smoke. She staggered, coughing black, one eye blistering shut, yet still charged the nearest rat and pulped its spine with a flail blow that folded it in half backward. Doran Blackpick understood a heartbeat sooner than Ricket, because dwarfs understood stone. He looked up, saw the powder nests, the tilted pillars, the chains. Saw Snagler Wormtongue capering along the upper ledge with a torch in one hand and a sack of stolen skaven pellets in the other. The dwarf captain roared something to his warriors and tried to wheel them back toward the north exit. Too late. Snagler hurled the first torch. It vanished beneath a corpse pile, and for an instant, nothing happened. Then the corpse pile erupted in blue-white flame and chunks of meat. A pressure wave rolled across the basin, followed by a second blast, where a hidden skaven globe stash cooked off beneath a stair. Green fire coughed from cracks. Dwarf black powder seized next in a thunderous boom from the ancestor statue chest, blasting stone splinters through skaven and goblins alike. Snagler shrieked with joy and flung his entire sack into the central floor. The mountain answered. Explosions walked across the basin in savage sequence. Pillars cracked. One sheared clean through and toppled into the melee, pulping those beneath into armor-flattened paste. The roof groaned like some buried god waking angry. Dust and fist-sized stones rained down. Chains snapped and whipped through the smoke. Gas globes burst in clusters, adding fresh poison to the fire and rubble. Skrika did not watch for long. He had planned too many collapses not to know when to run. "Loot what you can!" he screamed. Goblin instinct needed no second bidding. The west side turned from killers into scavengers in the space of a breath. Hands snatched purses, mask rigs, axe heads, rune plates hacked from armor, pouches of warpstone shards, rings from dead fingers, anything that shone or might be traded. Mogga kicked aside a severed dwarf arm to wrench a chain of keys from beneath it. Snagler scooped up a half-melted gas mask and a satchel of powder while still laughing. Skrika himself stooped only once, to rip Doran Blackpick's broken ancestor badge from a corpse pile where dwarf and skaven dead had merged into one ruined mass. He saw the captain once more through the dust. Doran was still on his feet beneath a failing arch, helm gone, one eye streaming blood, beard afire in places from powder flash. He was dragging a wounded warrior toward the north arch with one hand, while hacking at encroaching skaven with the other. Rickett Sootnose, mask shattered, fur burned off one flank, scrabbled up the opposite rubble slope shrieking for retreat in a voice gone raw with poison. Between them the basin caved in. The center floor dropped first. It went not as a neat hole, but as a broad, sucking collapse, slabs tilting inward and then vanishing under a roar of broken supports. Bodies, beasts, weapons, and whole sections of stair plunged together into darkness below. A giant squig disappeared mid-bite, still locked onto a skaven standard-bearer, as both fell. Dwarfs vanished with curses on their lips. Rats went down squealing. A wave of dust and ancient grave air blasted upward hard enough to stagger those on the ledges. The western escape shrank to a cracking shelf. Skrika drove the survivors up it at spear point. One goblin froze at the edge, staring at the void opening behind them. Skrika simply shoved him. The body hit a lower ledge with a wet crack and vanished into dust. Better a body than a bottleneck. They ran over leaning stone while the mountain tore itself apart. Behind them came more booms as trapped gas found flame. Ahead, the escape tunnel narrowed, twisted, split. Twice Skrika had to choose a branch without certainty. Twice he chose by draft and remembered slope. Once a cave-in took the rear of the file. He 3 more goblins with it, sealing off the screams almost immediately. Then, suddenly, they were through. The surviving goblins spilled into an upper ruin gallery, half a league from the basin, and collapsed among old fungus beds and broken dwarf cisterns, coughing dust and laughing the shrill laughter of creatures who had outlived good sense again. Mogga lay on her back, wheezing black phlegm, one arm crooked wrong, yet still clutching the ring of keys. Snagler sat cross-legged in the rubble, face grey with powder ash, smiling at nothing, while little blue flames danced in his palms and died. Of the tribe that had entered the hidden route, dreaming of easy murder and plunder, only a ragged, filthy core remained. Skrika stood among them, bleeding from a dozen cuts, half deaf in one ear, and grinning like a corpse remembered its favorite joke. He had not conquered Karak 8 Peaks. No goblin with a grain of wit would think in such terms. But he had done better. He had bitten both dwarfs and skaven in the same moment and lived. He had broken rivals, drowned a lieutenant in his own ambition, and turned an ancient lower road into a grave for anything foolish enough to claim certainty beneath the mountain that would travel. Stories move fast in 8 Peaks, faster than armies. By the next cycle every warren and burrow would have some crooked version of what happened below. Skrika Half-Moon had lured beard things and rats into a killing bowl. Skrika Half-Moon had stolen their loot. Skrika Half-Moon had brought the roof down on them all and crawled out richer. He liked that. He turned then, meaning only to check whether the route behind them had truly sealed. Instead he saw a fresh crack split through the wall of the gallery beside an old cistern, opened by the tremors below. Cold air breathed from it. Dust trickled down. Beyond the crack lay darkness deeper than the hidden road had been, and somewhere far within it came the faintest sound. Not dwarf hammers, not skaven claws, not squig squeals. Something else, ancient, hollow, waiting. Skrika wiped blood from his mouth and stepped closer. He could smell untouched stone down there, old metal, and the sweet promise of new betrayal. Around him the survivors moaned, coughed, counted loot, bound wounds, and thanked every mean god they knew for one more ugly dawn in the dark. Skrika only stared into the crack and smiled wider. Karak Eight Peaks, he thought, always had another throat to put a knife into.